You know, after watching and reviewing last week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring, I didn't think it was gonna get dark, but after watching the Dynamite Kid, man, it was pretty fucking brutal. Granted, it was not as bad, nowhere as close to the shit that Grizzly Smith did, which after a week of watching, I'm still in complete shock about the details of what happened with Grizzly Smith. Let's just jump into it. This is another Dark Side of the Ring review, guys. What's up? It's your boy Dick, and let's jump into it. This week is about the Dynamite Kid, aka Tom Billington, one of the most influential professional wrestlers of the modern era. And when I mean the modern era, I mean professional wrestling that has happened within the past 30 plus years. Um, Tom Billington, he was born in England, but made his way over to Calgary, and he was wrestling under the working for Stu Hart for Stampede Wrestling. He was one of the biggest draws for that organization, and him along with his cousin Davey Boy Smith, Bret Hart, and Jim Neidhart, they're considered to be the big four of Stampede in the '80s, and they were very influential in tag team wrestling as well as modern wrestling nowadays. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't get the likes of Bret Hart, Owen Hart, Chris Benoit. Tragically enough, uh, Jushin Thunder Liger, Eddie Guerrero, and to a lesser extent, even Bryan Danielson. You look at his style, and you can see a lot of his influence. He was influenced by the Dynamite Kid. Um, we start off with the documentary, and Lance Storm credits him as being one of the most influential wrestlers of all time, and you can see why. Um, they make it distinctly clear, like in the ring, he was one of the best in the world. Outside of the ring, though, is a different story, and as the documentary goes on, we see why. We see, what happened, and what how he became kind of this monster. Um, it's really interesting to see this documentary that of who was being interviewed. We see Lance Storm being interviewed. Mick Foley was being interviewed as well. I thought Mick Foley did a tremendous job. By the way, I got done watching the A&E documentary on Mick Foley. One of the best documentaries I think I've seen from A&E. By far, I'm gonna take that back. I think by far the best A&E documentary I've seen. Him and Brett, go out of your way to watch it. Ironically enough, Brett is not on here. And I thought that was a real shame for this episode because Brett was very close to, at one point, was very close to the Dynamite Kid. Brett's sister, I'm sorry, Brett's wife, Julie Hart, her sister married Tom. So that's where the connection comes from. And Julie and Michelle, which is Dynamite's ex-wife and Julie's sister, were being interviewed throughout this documentary. But I just find it really strange that Brett was not, and I was wondering why that was the case. Or in fact, he was not in any of the Vice documentaries. Now that I think about it, so I watched it a second time, and I noticed something toward the closing credits. As the credits were rolling, Vice gives a special thanks to Martha Hart, Dallas, and Wayne Hart. I know, and it's been widely reported that Martha and Brett have had a falling out. So that might explain as to why Brett was not involved in any of the documentaries. I think, and plus, I'm pretty sure he felt pretty excited by how they portrayed the Montreal Screwjob. So not having Brett on there, I think, did hurt a little bit, but it was still something that it was very important to watch. Mick Foley, like I said, was on here, and the reason why Mick Foley was being interviewed was because Mick Foley did wrestle as an enhancement talent in the '80s. He described Kid as basically being the real excellence of execution, and as I mentioned, he influenced so many wrestlers of the '80s and '90s, and really today. So that's the reason why Mick was on here. Dave Meltzer was being interviewed. He was very complimentary of him. He credits the Tiger Mask versus Dynamite Kid match as being probably one of the greatest, most influential matches of the 1980s, as long, um, on par with Macho Man and Ricky Steamboat, that influenced a generation of wrestlers. Uh, and you know what? I would agree. Those two matches are really what influenced modern wrestling nowadays. What has influenced modern wrestling. So if you've never seen that match, I would recommend to go really check out both matches, especially the Tiger Mask versus Dynamite Kid. You'll see a lot of similarities to today's wrestling. If you're not a fan of today's wrestling, you're probably not going to like it, but I would still give it a shot, especially if you're a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels fan or an Owen Hart fan, you like that style, you'll love that match. Definitely go check it out. Like I said, Dynamite Kid got his start in Japan. That's where he got his name. And this was around the time where, Vince was doing his expansion nationwide. He wanted to expand WWE to become this massive territory, this massive promotion, this worldwide phenomenon. So he needed wrestlers. And in '85, uh, Dynamite did sign with Davey, and they became a tag team, known as the British Bulldogs. And this is where we see really the transformation of Tom. He goes from a regular looking guy, and then not even a year later, he becomes this 5'10", 230 pounds, solid muscle. Just you could tell he was juiced. He was juiced beyond unrecognition. Man, like you talk about transformations. And the more you look at this documentary, especially for those who are familiar with Chris Benoit or have seen the Dark Side of the Ring Benoit special, you're going to see a lot of comparisons, a lot of parallels between the Dynamite Kid and Chris Benoit. So it's very very jarring to see. Hmm. So Jacques Rougeau, he's been interviewed, and for those who are unfamiliar, he was the Mountie in WWE, and he was part of several tag teams as well. Most famous with his brother Ray as part of the Fabulous Rougeaus. His story is very interesting because him and Dynamite have had quite a history together. Uh, his first impression of Dynamite was it. He was a scary individual, was an intimidating individual, and further backed up by Scott McGee and Danny Spivey. They were telling a story of how they were in the locker room back in the '80s, and the wrestlers what they would do to kill time was throw needles to the wall, and it would stick to the wall. So that's another example of how rampant the drug use was back in the '80s and how different it is than today. It was basically the Wild West. I mean, you go into a locker room and you see, these big guys just throwing needles to the wall or even on themselves, trying to get as big as they can. It is a different era. Like you look back at wrestling in the 1980s now with the lens of 2020, it is just unrecognizable. And the more we go into this, the more you'll see why. So as the documentary goes on, the Bulldogs have achieved almost instant success. At WrestleMania 2 in 1986, they won the tag team belts, and that was when they were at their peak in WWE by becoming the tag team champions. And they did beat Brutus Beefcake and Greg Valentine. They were more famously known as the Dream Team. So that was a high point for Dynamite Kid at that time. But we don't know how he is, and we go into more of his backstory. Tom Billington was from England, and as a young kid, he trained at the Wigan Gym um, I'm sorry, the Steak Pit in Wigan, England. And for those that are unfamiliar with that training, with really that wrestling school, it's a catch-all wrestling school. Basically, it's a shoot school. They teach you how to become a shoot wrestler, and they churned out the likes of Carl Gotch, Jack Dempsey, and Billy Robinson. So you talk about an alumni that comes from there. Some of the most influential wrestlers of the British scene. Really, really professional wrestling in general. If we want to go further, I thought Mick Foley in this documentary was phenomenal. He definitely told a lot of his intakes and his experiences with Tom. Um, he does talk about the infamous scene where he did wrestle the Bulldogs, and he took a short arm clothesline from Dynamite, which resulted in him breaking his jaw. And he mentions that when he broke his jaw, he could not eat solid food for 3 weeks, and went back to the room and immediately puked. He did not feel good, but he felt humbled by that experience, and that made him respect professional wrestling even more, and that made him want to achieve his dream. So that's another reason why Mick Foley was in this documentary, because he had connections with the Dynamite Kid in the way in the fact that the kid broke the man's jaw. Man, so going more into the Dynamite Kid, um, I don't know what it is with professional wrestlers back then, but they love to play ribs on other people. And a rib is supposed to be a joke, and they mention it throughout the documentary. It's supposed to be a joke. It's supposed to be lighthearted. A rib is not something where I don't know what's up with these wrestlers where they take it too far. Like uh, I just don't know. And Scott McGee, who happens to be one of the friends, Scott McGee and Dan Spivey were throughout this documentary as they were real life friends of the Dynamite Kid. Scott McGee tells a story of a young wrestler in WWE. He must have been an enhancement talent or something. Didn't really stick his name. Uh, but he tells a story about him. He was there and he was just very arrogant and very cocky. And it seems like that's the recurring theme that to set Tom off. Tom does not like people who are arrogant or entitled from his perspective, as he believed that he had to work his entire life to get to where he's at. And for those that take the shortcut, he did not like that and he felt disrespected. Anyways, so going to the story, he tells about how the kid was just so cocky and just being so obnoxious that one day they were all at a bar and Tom decides to slip in Halcyon into the man's drink. Halcyon is basically a sleeping pill. So he H bombed this poor guy. I wouldn't call him poor guy, but I guess as we're telling the story, he decides to H bomb this poor guy. The guy passes out in his room. Later on the night, Tom and Davey go up in his room and proceed to shit all over the man's clothes. I don't know about you guys, but I've always wondered what is up with wrestlers and shit. I don't understand. It's just they just find that humorous, and I never understood that connection. And um, if anyone can explain as to why, I would love to hear it. But it's not a prank when you defecate onto someone else and you defecate onto their belongings. Uh, Jacques said it best. He said that, you know, we can look at it back now and say it was a prank, but when you're on the road for 21, 22 straight days in a row, you you don't really find that funny at all. And your patience for that kind of behavior just wanes as the day goes by. So, yeah, at the end of the day, that person that got shat on did not make it in the business. He definitely left and realized that this was not for him. So we go back to Michelle. Michelle's being interviewed. Michelle is the ex-wife, and she noticed that that was just the beginning. But as the years went on, she noticed a fundamental change in Tom, and she believes that it was back in '86 when he was at a non-TV match against some enhancement talent, and it was during the match that Tom's body just flat out betrayed him. Like he could not stand. It must have been, he took a bad bump and his body just gave out on him completely to the point that he had to be rushed out of he had to be stretchered out rather, and he had to have emergency surgery where they had to remove two discs from his back. And they mentioned that the fourth and fifth lumbar were just completely shredded. And if you think this is bad, and this is how bad it was back in the 80s, this is how humane, like we hear these stories about how humane the schedule was. It was bad, like 300 days a year, being out on the road, wrestling 2 to 3 times a week. To me, a, this is how bad it was. 2 weeks after his surgery, Tom goes and wrestles a match, and it was him and Davey against the Hart Foundation. Mind you, Tom was in a wheelchair. his cousin Davey had to pretty much carry him to the ring. Luckily, he didn't wrestle at all. They laid him out. They put a spot where he laid him out. He was incapacitated for the rest of the match. Davey basically had to go 2-on-1. The reason why they did that was because they had to drop the belts. There was no way Tom was going to continue to wrestle in his current state. So he eventually wrestled. They eventually dropped the belts to Brett and Jim, and he proceeds to go home. And he goes back to his wheelchair. Does that sound familiar? If you watch the Brian Pillman documentary, Brian went through the same thing back in '97 when he tore his ankle. And when he was wrestling, he had to go to the ring all high on painkillers, did his match, come back to the ring, come back home, and sit in his wheelchair. That's how inhumane that was back then. That's flat out disturbing. And thank God that you don't hear these stories anymore and that this isn't happening, at least in the WWE. And I would say in the AEW as well. It's a different environment, but back then it was basically the Wild West. You either wrestled or you didn't get paid. There were no guarantee contracts. It was a different era. Thank God this is it's now a lot better for the wrestlers because you hear these stories, you wonder why they're all fucked up on painkillers and drugs and alcohol and all this kind of stuff. You need something to mask the pain. But man, it was brutal. Now, that part I didn't know. I wasn't aware that he had to go to the ring 2 weeks after his back surgery. But man, that is just insane. Oh, and if you think it was dark now, it gets worse. Now we get into the really dark stuff, the really dark stuff of Tom Billington. And Michelle tells a story where they were at a bar one night and she wasn't drinking. So Tom, unknowingly, he didn't know that she wasn't drinking. He grabs her drink, takes a sip, spits it back out, disgusted by it, not think knowing that it's not alcohol, it's tonic water. And Tom flips out. He proceeds to grab Michelle. They leave the bar. As they were driving home, Tom was playing chicken with the other cars on the road. And as soon as they get home, Tom throws her in the closet and she sleeps there for the night. I'm like, what in the fuck is that, dude? Like this is we just got done watching Grizzly Smith, and it was the darkest thing I have ever seen as far as a wrestling documentary goes. Anything related to professional wrestling, that was bad. This is just as bad. Like a Tom was a wife beater. This guy would just torment this poor woman in front of her kids. Man, like the more you hear about this guy, the more you see the similarities between him and Chris Benoit, which is eerie. And we're not even and this is just like the beginning. So we get to the infamous fight. Now, many of you guys are probably familiar with this fight between Jacques and Tom. Michelle mentions that she does not like Jacques at all. He considers him to be entitled, as I mentioned earlier. It seems like there's a recurring theme with the Dynamite Kid in that he does not like cocky or arrogant people who, in his mind, are entitled, and that they took a shortcut to get to achieve success, whereas Tom had to work his ass off. He had to struggle. He had to go through hell in order to achieve success. So there was already tension between the two. You know, Jacques is from a prestigious Canadian wrestling family, the Rougeaus. Tom, you know, he worked his ass off, but he eventually did end up being part of the Hart family as well. But anyways, so and as I mentioned, Tom was such a bully. So they tell the story of Tom going backstage and proceeds to slap the shit out of Jacques from behind and sucker punches Jacques basically. Jacques was, he felt he lost his manhood right there. And he talks to his father, and his father had recommended that before he goes to the arena to stop by the bank and grab a roll of quarters. So the next time that he goes to the arena, Jacques, and this is from Jacques' story perspective, he goes to Tom. Tom is drinking coffee. He goes up to Tom and he says, "Hey Tom." Tom turns around and Jacques proceeds to deck Tom. And as he hits him, four of his teeth are knocked out. But here's the catch. Tom still standing on his feet. Now, Scott McGee claims that it wasn't a roll of quarters and that it was in fact brass knuckles. Whatever it was, Tom took that punch and he was not phased, minus the fact that he lost four of his fucking teeth. That's how tough the Dynamite Kid was. He was a tough motherfucker. He was also a bully. And as far as I'm concerned, that a lot of people have heard about that infamous angle, and rightfully so. Dynamite Kid did get what he deserved, and that's just the shock part. I mean, as we get more into the stuff involving his wife, it gets really, really, really dark. It gets really bad, and man, it's they don't call this Dark Side of the Ring for nothing. Let's just put it that way, people. So Tom understandably wants revenge after what happened. However, he's unable to get revenge as during this time, Dino Bravo, a well-known Canadian wrestler, enters the WWE. The reason why I mention this is because if you've seen the Dino Bravo special, you understand why. This guy had connections to the Montreal Mob. So he had to be very careful because if he messed up, the mob would kill his family. And in fact, he thought that as well because he feared that the mob was going to go after his family. Hence, he had to move houses. He had to buy a gun just as a means to protect himself from this potential threat. And what didn't help was that Jacques proceeded to kind of make this situation much worse. And he does that by using Dino Bravo as a mole because he knows that cause he mentions that him and Dino do not like each other, but he knows that Dino would go to Dynamite and they were somewhat cordial. So Jacques proceeds to create a fake alias for a Montreal mobster, and he tells Dino this story. And he tells Dino that he has to report back to this mobster on a daily basis, but if he doesn't report to him, shit will hit the fan. And this was basically the final straw. And this is Jacques' side of the story. We don't know this to be the case as both Tom and Dino Bravo are both gone. So we kind of have to take him at his word since he's really the only one that's still around. And this pretty much was the end of Dynamite in WWE. He eventually leaves. As I mentioned, his family is forced to relocate for this potential threat. So he finally leaves WWE, goes back to Japan, just and also to Stampede as well. And his body's just not the same. This guy was a shell of his former self, and this was in the late '80s. So you could just imagine just trying to relive his glory days, and it was only a few years ago. This guy hit hard. This guy was reckless with his body, and he suffered, and he took a toll that later on we see what he becomes. And it's just, on the one hand, it's really sad, but at the same time, it's he got what was coming to him. So that's probably the best way I can describe it. Now, this story, the one that Michelle talks about, to me is probably the most traumatizing. Michelle tells a story about Tom coming home New Year's Eve 1990. And as he was coming in, she sees him pretty much fucked up. He was drunk. He had cuts all over his cheekbone. She says that you could see his bone. That's how deep that gash was. So just imagine this visual in front of his children. And this was pretty much the end for the marriage. Michelle just had enough. She could not deal with his shenanigans, so she pretty much gives him an ultimatum, or not an ultimatum, but she gives him a ticket to go back to England. She wants him out of the house. She felt unsafe, and rightfully so. Tom was pissed, proceeds to grab her by the hair, drag her across the room by her hair while she was pregnant with their third child. Tom then proceeds to go downstairs to grab a shotgun, points it to her head, threatening her, telling her that if you don't leave, I'm going to blow your brains out. Michelle calls his bluff. I don't know about you, but if there's a shotgun pointed to my head, I would not call someone's bluff. But uh, she felt that he was bluffing, and then eventually proceeds to call the police. And as she was telling the story, the dispatcher had told her that if he's giving you the option to leave, leave, get out of there. Basically, kind of dismissing the whole incident. I don't know about you guys, but I was just kind of shocked by that response. It was basically a lack of a response and no action from the cops. So eventually, she leaves the house and goes to her sister Julie's house, and that was pretty much it for Tom. Shortly after, he flies to England and he moves there for good. His return to the ring was nowhere as close as he had back in the early 80s. His body was given out on him, and in order to make a living, he moonlights as a bare knuckle boxer. This dude was a tough motherfucker, I'll say that. When your body is beat to shit and you still become a bare knuckle boxer, that's some fucking balls, man. This guy was a human pit bull, and he literally did act like a pit bull. I mean, he was not a big guy. He was a small guy, relatively small guy, in a land of giants. And in order to compensate that, he had to be aggressive. He had to get as big as he could, and he had to be reckless with his body. That was a way for him to stand out during that era, and ultimately, it costed him everything. His body ended up betraying him. His family life was pretty much destroyed. It was it was sad, but at the same time, it he brought that all on himself. Now, as I was watching this and doing some research, I didn't know this, but there was a time where WWE in the early '90s. This had to been either around maybe I want to say late '92, maybe early '93. Uh, Maybe even '94. I'm trying to think of the timeline, but this is when Brett was the WWE champion. So now that I think about it, I think it might have been around '94, and this was in the Wrestling Observer, where they go back to England, and Tom meets up with Brett and Brian Knobbs. Uh, Either one of I think it was Brian that told the story. Well, did you know Brett's the champion now? And Tom responds, "Oh, Intercontinental champion. Great. You know, at the time, the IC belt was the workhorse belt, and Tom saw Brett as a great IC champion. Little did he realize that Brett was the WWE champion. And when he found out about this, he was silent. He was not happy. And from Tom's perspective, he influenced. He believed Brett copied him. Owen copied him, and that he didn't really get the praise that he felt like he deserved, and that left a very bitter taste in Tom's mouth for many years. And this is where we get to the Chris Benoit stuff. So we fast forward several years into 2007. So the documentary takes us 10 years into the future, into 2007, and the Chris Benoit murders. Now, Vice also did, as I mentioned, they did do a Dark Side of the Ring. If you haven't watched it, check it out. It's definitely one of the, I hate to say the best ones they've done, given that it's a very dark subject matter, but it's a very important watch, especially as it relates to the Dynamite Kid. And as I mentioned, you see a lot of comparisons between him and Benoit. But when when that story was reported in 2007, it was such a huge media, it created such a huge media frenzy. And that incident, that definitely changed the landscape of professional wrestling. It forced WWE to enact a wellness policy. It really questioned a lot of what CTE is and what it does to an athlete's body. You know, that, and also, the years of professional football, and now we know what it does, and getting hit repeatedly in the head countless times, and how much damage it's done. It was such a eye-opening experience, and it definitely changed wrestling as well. Like, some have said for the worse, and if and it kind of is, because when Chris Benoit murdered his wife and his kid, wrestling was just, it it became like almost taboo for a while, and it took several years for it to finally lift that stench that the Benoit murders carried. But anyways, going back to the Chris Benoit murders, this is very important in that Michelle finally opens up to her kids about their father's true identity and what he really was. And they were just shocked. They were, and understandably so, because when you grow up and you know very little about your parents, and then you hear the story about how they they weren't who you thought they were, it it creates a lot of mixed emotions. And um understandably, the kids felt very like they didn't know how to feel. So it's completely understandable. And and eventually she goes on CNN and tells her story, as at the time the media was in a frenzy about the Hope and Wall thing, and they wanted to get as many wrestling figures or wrestling celebrities on the networks to kind of pick up to piggyback off of this tragedy. And this is where the public became really familiar with the Dynamite Kid and what he did outside the ring. And this is where this is where really you see like a lot of, and rightfully so, where the wrestling medium begins to turn their back on him. And this is where his legacy was tarnished. Was And rightfully so, like I mentioned, when you hear stories about him beating his wife, putting a shotgun to her head, and just being a flat out bully, that changes your perspective on that person. And you again see the parallels between Benoit and Kidd. And they were basically like, you could tell Chris Benoit, his biggest influence was the Dynamite Kid. Pegasus Kid, Dynamite Kid, Benoit, great technical wrestler, Dynamite Kid, great technical wrestler. They both got so big because they had the small man complex, and they felt like they needed to get big. And they both got jacked beyond recognition. And they both were very abusive to their own body in the ring. That eventually caught up to them, and it became tragedy. The only difference is that Dynamite Kid didn't take his wife and his son. Thank God he didn't kill anyone, but he was pretty damn close. Um, Unfortunately, there was a huge trade-off, and that was Dynamite. Dynamite's body gave out on him. He had to be confined to a wheelchair. In the 90s, he lost use of his legs and pretty much became wheelchair bound for the rest of his life. He became a shell of his former self. And when you looked at him and you saw him compared to the 80s, it was really sad to see. But again, given what we know now, it's almost it's a tragedy, but it's almost justified in a way. And I hate to use the term justified, given um, I don't wish that on anyone, but it's just really sad to see. And um, if you were a Dynamite Kid fan going into this episode and you didn't know anything about the man, which is kind of hard to see given now that we have access to information, you're going to walk out of this not liking the man, even though you want to feel bad for him, but at the same time you can't. And just like with Chris Benoit, where as great as he was in the ring, that one incident overshadowed his career, and what he did to his wife and to his kids, it's going to unfortunately overshadow the legacy that he left in the ring. And toward the end, Mick Foley, I thought he, as I said, Mick Foley was phenomenal throughout this documentary. Uh, he ends the show with the Bruce Springsteen quote: "Trust the art, not the artist." And he is 100% correct, especially in professional wrestling. Um, they're artists. Like all artists, they are deeply flawed individuals. It's almost like do as I say, not as I do. And with Dynamite, he influenced a generation of wrestlers. His style pretty much was the blueprint of the modern wrestling era. However, his actions tarnish his legacy, and it's quite a shame. And I thought this documentary did an overall excellent job on it, on capturing, the tragedy of the Billington family and the legacy that he had in the ring, and it was kind of a fair balance. And it's crazy, like this is actually the end of the first half of season three. This is going to be a long season, and the first half of the season has been pretty much been excellent. Started off with Brian Pillman, and then last week, I mentioned Grizzly Smith, and I'm still kind of recovering from watching the Grizzly Smith documentary. This one's up there as far as watching. I would definitely, watching this one, watching the Grizzly Smith one, and the Brian Pillman, and also maybe the Collision in Korea. I think those to me are like the where I don't want to say the best, but definitely the ones that I would watch. And if you really want to get a true understanding of Dark Side of the Ring, those are the episodes to watch. Uh, Dark Side of the Ring's going to take a break for the summer. They're going to come back later on in the season, I believe in the fall, and we're going to get more stories regarding Bruiser Bedlam, the infamous steroid trial in the early '90s between Vince McMahon and the U.S. government, FMW, the infamous Playwright from Hell, Luna Vachon, XPW, and Chris Canyon. And looking at the list of the second half, it I'm intrigued to look at Bruiser Bedlam, and I'm willing to give all of them a shot, especially FMW and XPW, which I was fans of back in the day. There's a lot of stuff regarding those two, especially XPW. XPW was an LA brand, was basically a huge ECW ripoff. So I'm intrigued to hear that story. Um, None of them catch an eye as the first half of the season. I think this might be very top heavy when it comes to season three, but um, again, when you have your expectations low, you'll be pleasantly surprised. So I'm hoping that some of these episodes are going to blow it out of the park, and they're going to be much bigger, much better than I anticipate. But we'll see. But yeah, this is going to be it for a while, not at least until the fall season begins, and we'll be back here. Uh, right now, our schedule is very, very tight at the moment. We're going to try to at least get an episode out this weekend. If not, I might have to do a review. I'm going to talk to the guys tonight, if not tonight, tomorrow, and we'll see what happens because I know Takeover is going to be this Sunday, another pay per view. And I just felt like we just got done watching a pay per view 2 weeks ago. So um, if we can't get a predictions up this weekend, I'm going to try to jump on it this weekend and get a quick prediction. And we're going to try to do what we can. It's very busy. We're all very busy right now. We're at a time of our lives where we got priorities. So hopefully we can get an episode up. Um, but just the one thing I will say is thank you guys for watching. Thank you for liking this video, disliking this video. Hell, if you don't like it, but you're watching it, cool. I mean, I appreciate it. I know I ramble on a lot, but thank you so much, guys, and I'll talk to you guys soon. And until then, peace.